The G7 summit enters its final day. Prime Minister Boris Johnson is pledging £500 million to protect the world's oceans. He's announcing a Blue Planet Fund at the G7 summit in Cornwall today. Sir David Attenborough will also be there to tell world leaders that climate change gives them some of the most important decisions in human history. G7 nations are expected to commit to almost halve their emissions by 2030 compared to 2010. Let's speak this morning to Tim Burke, the founding director of the environmental think tank E3G and a former government policy advisor on the environment. Good morning, Tim.
Tom, sorry.
Oh, excuse me. Tim, can you hear me?
Sorry, it's Tom.
Oh, Tom, I apologise. That's my mistake. I'm really sorry about that. Thank you, Tom, for your patience with us and thank you for your expertise. Let's talk climate then. How enthused are you by the noises that you're hearing from the G7 leaders?
I'm not very enthused, to tell the truth. The blue 500 million blue ocean fund was already announced before we are running out of time, as David Attenborough is telling us to do things. So we're not going to scale. I think leaders have got the idea of the urgency and they've understood that we need to make the recovery a green recovery. And they've understood that if we don't do something about vaccines, we won't be able to have people working together to address the problem. So I think they've understood that they've got to do this in conjunction with other things, but they're not yet going to scale in terms of particularly the amount of money they're willing to spend.
I always struggle with climate change and the responsibility that leaders clearly have, but actually how they should direct their efforts. A lot of this is a kind of personal responsibility. You know, do I drive a diesel car or not, for example? But in terms of what the government and indeed the governments of the G7 are going to leave this weekend, having agreed and therefore implementing in their nations, I mean, what is the detail? What will change in the coming weeks and months?
The really important thing now is we have the technologies we need to solve the problem and meet the targets. We have them, but we're not deploying them fast enough. And we need to mobilise both public money and private money to take those solutions that we already have and engage them to scale as soon as we possibly can. And that's the thing that governments can do most of all. People can play their part, individuals can play their part. What we've seen all over the world is that individuals really are willing to play their part, but that's not good enough unless governments do what specifically they can do, and that's to change the energy system in particular, and to do it very fast indeed.
When it comes to climate change and the G7, should we pay attention to who is not at the table and who is not discussing things? And of course, I'm talking countries like China, for example, who are not part of these pledges.
Well, actually, Callum, they are part of the pledges. They've made similar pledges both in China, and India is as big a problem as China in terms of coal use. But they both need to be part of this thing. So a very important part as we go forward through this year, from the G7 now to the G20 later in the year, to the UN General Assembly in September, and then on to the COP26 in Glasgow, is to make sure that we're working very hard to bring China and bring India on board.
Understood. So when it comes then to COP26, which will be the next meeting of leaders from around the world, is that really the time that we are going to see action kick in? I'm trying to sort of timeline all of this because it's, time is finite when it comes to addressing climate change.
You're absolutely right about that, Callum. And that sequence of meetings from now until Glasgow will determine whether or not we can be successful in Glasgow. And that means in Glasgow, we've really got to increase the level of ambition and the commitments governments have made to meeting that target. And we've got to take them up a lot more than they currently are. We're way behind where we need to be. It's not enough to talk about getting to net zero by 2050. You've got to talk about where you need to be by 2030 if you're going to get there by 2050. And that's the bit that we're missing at the moment. We don't have a clarity about what those next steps need to be and who's going to play what part in getting us there.
Should we do a bit of credit where credit's due? So while the G7 are expected to make this pledge to have emissions by 2030 compared to 2010, well, with the UK already surpassing that commitment, are we doing okay? Are we leading from the front in the context of the G7 versus climate change?
We've made more commitments than any of them. We've decarbonized our economy faster than anybody else. But we are clearly not doing what we need to do to meet our own targets. And then we ought to be careful that that's the example that other countries don't follow. In other words, setting high targets, being ambitious in what you say, but being much less ambitious in what you do. We do deserve credit for having given a global lead, and other countries have copied us in terms of introducing climate legislation. But if we don't continue to lead, then it's very easy for us to fall back.
And in terms of that leading, we've kind of mentioned the money, the commitments that are being made, but it is notable that we don't have a great deal of detail on helping developing countries get clean technology and what the G7 are actually going to do in terms of intervening in those sorts of situations as well. Is that getting enough priority? How high on the priority list should that be?
Very near the top. We can't do this. No country can do this on its own. We've got to get those countries in the low income and middle income countries to join in. They've been very badly hit by the virus. So we need to help their economies recover. And we need to make sure that when we do that, we do it in a green way. So it's not just the amount of money, and we're not doing enough on that front. 1.4 billion is not enough. Then we also need to make sure that that money is spent in a way that helps with decarbonisation.
Are the G7 leaders the only people in the world who aren't listening to Sir David Attenborough?
I think everybody's listening to David Attenborough. He spent a lot of his life making sure we listen to him when he speaks.
Do they? I mean, this is perhaps a trivial point, but one I'm going to ask about nonetheless. Are we right to criticise global leaders for flying into a summit like this when we've all spent 18 months talking to each other over the internet?
I don't think we actually are going to get here by a sort of shame game on people. I really don't. There is something you can do in face-to-face conversation that you simply can't do as a bunch of electrons. And I think that really matters in something as difficult as this.
Yeah, of course. So to sort of sum up, I suppose then, Tom, we're looking for detail, we're looking for money, and we're looking for this to be a global solution to what is absolutely a global problem.
That's right.
Okay. Really nice to speak to you this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you for your time. That is Tom Burke, the founding director of the environmental think tank E3G and a former government policy advisor on the environment. Lovely to speak to him this morning.